the candle had burned down to nothing by the time Lillian stopped crying. She sat on the cold floor of her bedroom, back pressed against the foot of the bed, knees drawn to her chest. The fire in the small hearth had gone low, and the room held a chill that seeped through her thin cotton nightgown and settled deep into her bones. She did not move to add more wood. She simply sat and breathed, and stared at the door as though she expected someone to walk through it and tell her that the evening had not happened the way it did. No one came. The house was quiet now. The laughter from downstairs had faded hours ago, along with the sound of her stepmother's voice and the bright, musical giggle that always belonged to Clarice. That giggle had followed Lillian through her whole life, the way a shadow follows a person, never quite attached, never quite gone. It surfaced at dinner tables and drawing rooms and garden parties. It surfaced tonight in the middle of the parlor, in front of everyone, and it had done what it always did. It had made Lillian feel like something that did not belong in the room. Lillian pressed her palm flat against the top of her head. Smooth, bare, cool to the touch. She had been bald since she was 9 years old. A fever had taken her hair in the space of 2 weeks and never given it back. Or the physicians had used long words and sympathetic expressions and had ultimately offered nothing useful. Her father, Lord Ashmore, had looked at her differently after that, not with cruelty, but with a kind of helpless sorrow that was almost worse than cruelty, because it asked nothing of him and cost her everything. Her stepmother, Lady Ashmore, had simply begun the quiet and efficient work of moving Lillian to the edges of family life. Not violently, not in any way that could be pointed to and named. Just steadily, the way water wears down stone over years and years until the stone no longer remembers its original shape. It was Clarice who did it with joy. Clarice, who was golden-haired and long-throated and admired by every eligible man in 3 counties. Clarice, who wore her beauty the way some people wear armor, always forward, always gleaming, always angled to wound. She was 2 years younger than Lillian, and had spent those 2 years growing taller in confidence with every inch Lillian shrank in spirit. There was nothing accidental about Clarice. Every word she spoke in company had been considered first, shaped for effect, and released at exactly the right moment to do the most damage while appearing to do none at all. Tonight was Lady Ashmore's small dinner gathering. 12 guests, the good china, with the rose-colored candles arranged down the center of the long table. Lillian had been permitted to attend because her father had insisted, one of his rare and increasingly feeble acts of paternal will, the kind that reminded her he had once loved her before the world had made loving her feel complicated. She had worn her best dress, a warm ivory gown with cream lace at the collar, and she had pinned a silk cap over her bare scalp, the kind ladies wore for modesty, fitted and plain and unassuming. She had thought it looked dignified. She had been wrong, or at least Clarice had decided she was wrong, and in that house, Clarice's decisions had a way of becoming truth before anyone thought to question them. It happened between the soup course and the fish. Lord and Lady Greyton were seated across the table, their son Thomas beside them, a young man of reasonable fortune and unremarkable character, who had been looking at Lillian with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been genuine interest. Lillian had not been sure. She had not been sure of such things in a long time, had trained herself not to be sure, because certainty in that direction had only ever led to disappointment. But she had felt the weight of his gaze, and she had allowed herself, just for a moment, the small and dangerous pleasure of thinking that perhaps she was visible after all. Perhaps she existed in a room in some way that mattered. Then Clarice laughed. Not at anything Thomas said, not at a joke or a story or a moment of natural comedy that arose from the table's conversation. She laughed her bright, sudden laugh, and then she said, in that carrying voice that always managed to sound like an accident when it was anything but, "Do forgive my sister, Thomas, 'cause she does try so hard with her appearance, though I suppose it must be terribly difficult to make any impression at all when there is quite literally nothing on top." She had touched her own gleaming hair as she said it, a gesture so light and so deliberate it could have been mistaken for nothing. Smooth as river stone, and half as warm. I do admire her persistence. The table had gone quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Lady Grayton had coughed softly into her napkin. Lord Grayton had reached for his wine with sudden and urgent interest. Thomas had looked at his soup as though it contained the answer to a question he had not yet thought to ask. Lady Ashmore had smiled the smile she wore when things were going precisely as she had intended them to go. And Lillian had sat very still, the way she had learned to sit over years of practice, like a creature that goes motionless when it senses a predator and hopes that stillness might be mistaken for invisibility. Her father had said nothing. That was the part that had followed her up the stairs and into the cold of her room and settled there like a stone at the bottom of still water. Not Clarice's words, though those had cut cleanly and deep and would leave the kind of mark that did not show on the surface. Not the silence of the guests, though that had its own particular sting, the sting of being witnessed in your humiliation and offered nothing, not even the small dignity of someone pushing back. It was her father's stillness that had undone her, the way he had lifted his fork and continued eating as though nothing in the room had shifted, as though his eldest daughter had not just been stripped of the last thin layer of composure she had managed to construct around herself and left there, bare and blinking in the candlelight, with nowhere to look and no one to look to. She pressed her palm to the top of her head again. She had removed the silk cap when she came upstairs. She always did. Alone in her room, she did not pretend. The cap was for the world outside this door, a small courtesy she extended to the comfort of others, a way of softening her strangeness so that people did not have to work so hard to look at her. But here, with no eyes on her, she was simply herself, bare-skulled and quiet and aching in a way that lived somewhere behind her ribs, and had been living there for so long she had almost stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing the sound of rain after hours of hearing it fall. She was 23 years old. In the world she inhabited, that was a number that arrived with its own particular weight. Unmarried daughters of minor gentry did not improve with age in the estimation of society. They became problems to be managed, then embarrassments to be hidden, then simply absences that no one quite thought to account for. And Lillian had watched this process begin in the way one watches weather change on the horizon, knowing it is coming, unable to stop it, learning only to brace. She had long ago given up the idea of a season. Lady Ashmore had quietly discouraged it, suggesting that the expense was too great and the outcome too uncertain given Lillian's particular situation, a phrase that was never clarified and never needed to be. Clarice had been given 2 full seasons and was now in the middle of her 3rd, or attended by the finest dressmakers in London and escorted to every ball and dinner party of consequence. The contrast was not accidental. Nothing in this house was accidental. But there was a letter. Lillian's eyes moved to the small writing desk beneath the window. The letter had arrived that morning, before the dinner, before Clarice, before the soup course and the 3 seconds of silence that had rearranged something permanently inside her chest. It had been addressed to Lord Ashmore, but her father had passed it to her without explanation over the breakfast table, sliding it across the cloth with one finger, as though the act of giving it to her was itself a kind of burden he was relieved to set down. She had not opened it then. She had folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of her morning dress and carried it through the day without reading it, some instinct telling her to wait, to find a private moment, to be alone when she learned what it contained. She rose from the floor now, stiff with cold, and crossed to the desk. The letter was sealed with dark wax, pressed into the shape of a crest she did not immediately recognize. A crown above a falcon. Clean lines, the kind of seal that spoke of old money and older names. She broke it carefully, unfolded the single page within, and held it toward the dying firelight to read. The handwriting was not the handwriting of a secretary. It was direct and even, neither ornate nor plain, the kind of hand that suggested a person who wrote what they meant and did not dress it in unnecessary flourish. It reads as follows: Lord Ashmore, it is my understanding that your eldest daughter, Miss Lillian Ashmore, remains unmarried and resides at Ashmore Park. I write to inform you that I intend to attend the Greyfield Assembly Ball at the end of the month, and that I would consider it agreeable if Miss Ashmore were in attendance also. I ask nothing further at this time. I ask only that she come. The Duke of Calverton. Lillian read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and stood very still in the dark and the cold, her bare head and her bare heart both equally exposed, equally unable to make sense of what had just landed in her hands. The Duke of Calverton. She knew the name the way everyone in England knew the name. It was the kind of name that preceded itself, that entered rooms before the man did, or that sat at the top of every social list and the front of every ambitious mother's mind. The Duke of Calverton was 30 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a fortune so vast that the number attached to it had long since stopped meaning anything concrete and had simply become a symbol of distance between himself and ordinary life. He was said to be cold. He was said to be precise. He was said to choose his words and his company with equal and unsparing care. He had never, or to anyone's knowledge, singled out a woman in this way before. He had certainly never singled out a woman like Lillian. She picked the letter up again and read it a 3rd time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more explicable. They did not. The Duke of Calverton wished her to attend the Greyfield Assembly Ball. He had written to her father directly. He had used the word agreeable in relation to her presence, a word that, from a man of his position, carried a weight that an ordinary person might reserve for words far more dramatic. She did not understand it. She stood at her desk in the cold, dark room, with her bare head and her broken evening behind her, holding a letter from the most powerful unmarried man in England, and she did not understand a single word of it except that it was addressed to her, and that it was real. Downstairs, she heard Clarice's voice, still bright, still carrying, talking to Lady Ashmore about something that involved the word charming repeated several times. The sound drifted up through the floorboards and settled around Lillian like smoke. She folded the letter. She placed it back on the desk. She climbed into bed without changing the fire or adding any wood, pulled the blankets to her chin, and lay on her back in the dark with her smooth, bare head against the pillow, and her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling above her. Or the Duke of Calverton wanted her at the ball. She did not know why. She did not know what it meant, or what he intended, or whether this was some elaborate cruelty dressed in expensive wax and a falcon crest. She did not know if she was brave enough to go, or foolish enough, or whether those two things, in her particular life, had always been the same. What she knew was this. For the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, something in the world had turned in her direction. Not toward Clarice, not toward Lady Ashmore's careful arrangements, or her father's cautious silences. Toward her, toward Lillian, toward the girl who sat on cold floors in the dark and pressed her palm to a bare head and tried to remember that she was still worth something, even when every person in her life seemed determined to remind her that she was not. She closed her eyes. Outside the window, the wind moved through the old oaks at the edge of the garden, and the last of the fire settled into quiet ash, and the house held its breath around her, the way houses do when something is about to change. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she finally did, her hand was resting on the letter at the bedside table, and her face, for the first time that evening, was still. The morning came grey and indifferent, the way mornings often did at Ashmore Park in late autumn, with a sky the colour of old linen and a wind that pressed against the window panes and found every gap in the old stone walls. Lillian was already awake when the light arrived. She had been awake for some time, lying still beneath her blankets, with the letter on the bedside table, and the question of it pressing down on her chest like a hand. She read it again in the morning light. It was no different from the night before. The words had not softened or hardened. The falcon crest was still there, precise and undeniable. The Duke of Calverton still wanted her at the Greyfield Assembly Ball, and the request was still the most confounding thing that had ever arrived at Ashmore Park in all her 23 years of living there. She dressed herself, as she always did, without the help of a maid, or Lady Ashmore had quietly redistributed the household staff years ago in a series of small and reasonable-sounding decisions that had resulted, entirely by coincidence, in Lillian having no personal attendant and very little access to the better rooms of the house before noon. She pinned the silk cap over her bare head, smoothed the front of her grey morning dress, and went downstairs. The breakfast room was occupied. Clarice sat at the head of the table in her father's customary chair, which she had taken to using whenever Lord Ashmore slept late, which was increasingly often. She was dressed in a deep rose gown that caught the thin morning light beautifully, and she was reading a letter of her own with the satisfied expression of a person who expects good news and receives it regularly. Lady Ashmore sat across from her with a cup of tea, already dressed, already composed, already fully herself, in the way that women like her always seemed to be, as though they assembled themselves in the night and emerged each morning complete. Neither of them looked up when Lillian entered. She took her usual seat at the side of the table, the one nearest the door and furthest from the fire, and poured herself tea from the pot that had already gone slightly cool. There was bread and a small dish of butter and some cold sliced meat arranged on a platter that had been positioned closer to Clarice than to the center of the table. Lillian reached for the bread without comment. "You look tired," Clarice said, not looking up from her letter. "I did not sleep well," Lillian said. "One can tell." Clarice turned a page. "You really ought to do something about the shadows under your eyes. They make you look unwell. Or more unwell, I suppose I should say." Lady Ashmore made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and functioned as both. Lillian buttered her bread and said nothing. She had learned, not over many years of mornings exactly like this one, that silence was the most efficient response. Engagement only extended the performance. Clarice required an audience to sustain herself, and an audience that refused to react was a disappointing one. Given enough quiet, she would eventually redirect her attention elsewhere. But this morning, Lillian had something in the pocket of her grey dress that made silence feel differently weighted than usual. The letter sat there against her hip. I folded small, present and warm, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Lord Ashmore came down at 9:30, which was earlier than usual, and suggested a restless night of his own. He was a tall man who had once been handsome in the straightforward way of men who do not think much about their appearance, and who now carried his age in the set of his shoulders and the line of his jaw. He greeted Lady Ashmore with a nod, and Clarice with a faint smile, and sat at the end of the table and began filling his plate without ceremony. "Father," Lillian said, before the moment could be swallowed by the ordinary machinery of breakfast, "I would like to speak with you this morning. When you have a moment." He looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who has grown accustomed to not being addressed by a particular person. "Of course," he said, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed. After breakfast, Clarice looked up from her letter for the first time. Her eyes moved from Lillian to Lord Ashmore and back again, with the quick, assessing intelligence she applied to anything that suggested a shift in the domestic arrangement. She said nothing, but her gaze sharpened in a way that Lillian recognized and had learned to be careful of. After breakfast, Lord Ashmore received her in the small study at the back of the house, the one that smelled of old books and pipe smoke, and the particular staleness of a room that is used infrequently. He sat behind the desk, and Lillian sat in the chair across from him, and placed the letter on the wood between them. He looked at it for a moment before picking it up. She watched his face as he read. She had always been good at reading her father's face, perhaps because she had spent so many years studying it for some sign that she still occupied a place of warmth in his affections. What she saw now was not what she expected. She had anticipated confusion or dismissal or the careful neutrality he deployed when he did not want to commit to a position. Instead, she saw something that moved quickly across his features and then was gone. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like recognition. "You have read this," he said. It was not a question. "You gave it to me," she said. "Yes." He set it down. He was quiet for a moment, then turning his ring on his finger in the way he did when he was thinking through something, he would rather not think through. Calverton. You know him, Lillian said. It came out more certain than she intended. Her father looked at her. I knew his father. Many years ago. Before your mother died. Before a great deal happened. He paused. The current Duke is not a man I know personally, but his reputation is not a small thing. Why would he write to you about me? Lillian asked. Or why would he know my name at all? Lord Ashmore was quiet for a long moment. Outside the study window, a sparrow landed on the stone sill and then departed. The fire in the small grate popped once and settled. I may have written to him, her father said finally, in the tone of a man confessing something minor that is in fact substantial. Lillian stared at him. You wrote to the Duke of Calverton. Several months ago. It was a letter of a general nature. I mentioned the family. I mentioned you. He shifted in his chair. I did not expect a reply. I certainly did not expect this particular reply. What did you say about me? He met her eyes, and in his, she saw the thing she had been looking for all these years, the love that had not died, but had simply buried itself under the weight of his second marriage, and his diminishing will, and his inability to fight the slow erosion of his household by the woman he had married to manage it. It was there. It was small and tired and ashamed of itself. But it was there. I told him the truth, Lord Ashmore said quietly, that you were the finest person in this house, and that I had failed you. The room was very still. Lillian did not trust herself to speak for a moment. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and breathed carefully through the sudden pressure behind her eyes. The ball is at the end of the month, she said at last. Well, yes. He asks only that I attend. Yes. She lifted her eyes back to his. Then I will go. Something shifted in her father's face. Not relief exactly. Something older and more complicated than relief. I will arrange it, he said. You will need a proper gown. I will speak to Lady Ashmore. You need not involve Lady Ashmore, Lillian said, with a steadiness that surprised even her. I have the allowance my grandmother left me. I have never spent it. It will cover what is needed. Her father nodded slowly. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have underestimated for a long time and are only now beginning to properly see. Lillian, he said. It is all right, father, she said, and she meant it in the way one means things that are not quite all right, but are no longer worth the cost of dwelling on. It is going to be all right. She rose, took the letter from the desk, and left him there with his ring and his fire and his long overdue guilt. In the hallway outside the study, she nearly walked directly into Clarice. Clarice was not a woman who lingered in hallways without purpose. She was standing precisely where the hallway narrowed beside the study door, which meant she had been standing there long enough and close enough to hear at least some of what had passed between Lillian and their father. Her expression was smooth and pleasant, which was always the expression that required the most caution. A private conversation with father, Clarice said lightly. How unusual. Good morning, Clarice, Lillian said, and moved to step past her. Clarice did not move, not aggressively, just enough to make passing awkward, the kind of obstruction that could always be explained as nothing. You seem different this morning, she said, tilting her head. There is something almost purposeful about you. It does not entirely suit you, I must say. "I am simply going upstairs," Lillian said. "Of course you are." Clarice smiled, sweet and watchful. "Where else would you go?" Lillian met her eyes for a moment. She did not answer. She simply stepped around her stepsister with more grace than she felt, and walked to the foot of the stairs and began climbing, one hand on the banister, the letter pressed to her side through the fabric of her dress. She did not look back. Upstairs, she sat at her writing desk and took out a clean sheet of paper and her pen and the small bottle of ink she kept in the top drawer. She sat for a long moment, looking at the blank page, thinking about what she wanted to say and how to say it in a way that was honest without being desperate, grateful without being diminished. Then she dipped her pen and wrote, "Your Grace, I have received your letter, and I will attend the Greyfield Assembly Ball as you have requested. I confess I do not know the reason for your interest, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I have learned that honesty costs less in the long run than performance, so I will say simply that your letter arrived on a difficult evening, and that it meant more than you could know. I will be there. Lillian Ashmore." She read it back once. Then she sealed it and addressed it, and set it aside to be posted. And she sat for a while longer at the desk, with the weak autumn light falling through the window onto her bare hands and her silk-capped head, feeling something in her chest that was new and fragile, and not entirely unwelcome. It felt, cautiously and against all reasonable expectations, like the early edge of hope. She was careful with it. She had been hopeful before and had learned the particular cost of hope in a house like this one. But she did not put it away. She let it sit there quietly in her chest like a small and steady flame, too new to trust entirely, but too real to deny. Outside, the grey sky was beginning, very slowly to lighten. The gown was the colour of wine. Lillian had chosen it herself in a dressmaker's shop in the village of Harwick, 12 miles from Ashmore Park, and therefore safely beyond the radius of Lady Ashmore's social connections and Clarice's pointed opinions. The dressmaker was a woman named Mrs. Fallow, small and sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular gift of seeing what a person needed before the person had finished explaining it. And she had looked at Lillian for a long moment, when Lillian removed her travelling bonnet and the silk cap beneath it, looked without flinching and without performing the elaborate neutrality that people often deployed in place of genuine ease. And then she had simply said, "Sit here and let me think." What she had thought, it turned out, was this. The bare head was not a problem to be dressed around. It was a fact to be dressed with. There was no point in suggesting arrangements of hair or decorative pins or any of the other small architectures that other women use to construct themselves for an evening. What Lillian had was a long neck and a clean skull, and a face that, without the distraction of hair, existed in a kind of unguarded clarity that most faces never achieved. The gown should do the work that other women distributed across their whole appearance, for it should be extraordinary at the hem and quiet at the shoulder, and fitted in a way that moved with her rather than containing her. The wine silk had been Mrs. Fallow's suggestion. Lillian had looked at it doubtfully at first, accustomed as she was to choosing colours that did not draw attention, that blended into the background of a room and made her easy to overlook. But Mrs. Fallow had held the fabric up beside Lillian's face and said simply, "Well, there," in the tone of a person who has found the right answer and does not require agreement to know it. There had been 2 fittings. Lillian had made the 12-mile journey both times in the Ashmore Park carriage, which her father had arranged quietly and without announcement, which meant that Lady Ashmore knew about it, but had chosen not to intervene, which itself was interesting. Perhaps she did not know about the letter, but perhaps she had decided that whatever Lillian was doing was inconsequential enough to ignore. Either way, Lillian was grateful for the small space of privacy. Now the ball was 4 days away, and the gown was hanging on the back of her wardrobe door, and Lillian stood looking at it in the early evening light and felt the complicated mixture of feelings that had been her constant company since the letter arrived. Hope, still small and careful. Fear, which was less careful and considerably louder. And underneath both of those, something quieter and more fundamental, a question she had been asking herself in different forms since the night she had sat on her cold floor and pressed her palm to her bare head. What did the Duke of Calverton actually want? She had thought about it from every angle she could construct. She had considered and discarded the possibility that it was a jest, to some elaborate social cruelty, arranged for the amusement of people with too much power and too little conscience. The letter had not felt cruel. It had felt precise and deliberate and strangely careful, as though each word had been chosen with more attention than the brevity of the message suggested. She had considered the possibility of a misunderstanding, that perhaps he had intended to write about Clarice, and had simply confused the names. But her father had said he wrote about her specifically, had named her, had offered the Duke information about her that was particular and personal. She had considered, late at night when sensible thinking gave way to the kind that could not be controlled, the possibility that it was exactly what it appeared to be, that a powerful man had heard something about her and had wanted to know more, that she, Lillian, bald and overlooked and systematically moved to the edges of her own life, had somehow caught the attention of someone who existed at the very center of everything. That possibility was the most frightening of the 3, because it was the one she most wanted to be true. The days before the ball moved with the strange double quality of time that is both too slow and too fast, each hour long in the living of it, and yet the week somehow shrinking visibly when she looked at it from the outside. She spent her mornings in the small library off the east corridor, reading, which had always been her refuge, and her education in equal measure. She spent her afternoons walking in the garden when the weather permitted, which it did not always, autumn being what it was. She avoided Clarice as much as the geography of the house allowed, which was not entirely successful. On the 3rd day before the ball, Clarice found her in the garden. She came around the corner of the yew hedge with the air of someone who has been looking and has finally located what they were looking for, which meant the encounter was not accidental, regardless of how it was about to be presented. She was wearing a heavy wool coat in deep green, and her cheeks were bright from the cold, and she looked, as she almost always looked, infuriatingly lovely. "You have been avoiding me," Clarice said pleasantly. "I have been in the garden," Lillian said. "Those are not mutually exclusive." Clarice fell into step beside her, uninvited and untroubled by the absence of an invitation. "I have heard something interesting," Lillian continued walking. "Have you?" "Thomas Grayton mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Margaret Forsyth, who mentioned it to me." Clarice paused for effect, a theatrical habit she had never bothered to disguise. Apparently the Duke of Calverton is to attend the Greyfield Assembly Ball. Lillian kept her pace even and her face still. Is he? It is very unusual. He almost never attends public events of that kind. He is said to find them tedious. Another pause. I am told he has expressed a specific interest in attending this one. No one seems to know why. People do things for reasons they do not always share, Lillian said. Clarice looked at her sideways. You do not seem surprised. Should I be? The silence that followed had a texture to it, the texture of Clarice rearranging her understanding of a situation she had thought she already fully grasped. It was not a silence Lillian had ever been able to produce in her stepsister before, and she was careful not to let the satisfaction of it show on her face. You know something, Clarice said. Not lightly now, though the brightness had dropped out of her voice, and what was left was something more direct and considerably less decorative. I know a great many things, Lillian said. Most of them I have had to learn on my own. Clarice stopped walking. Lillian took 3 more steps before she stopped as well, and turned, because turning away entirely felt like a surrender she was no longer willing to make. Clarice was looking at her with an expression Lillian had not seen on her face before, or at least hadn't seen directed at her. It was not cruelty, and it was not amusement. It was something closer to unsettlement, the expression of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just encountered evidence that one of those assumptions may be incorrect. You are going to the ball, Clarice said. It was not a question, so Lillian did not answer it as one. She simply held her stepsister's gaze and let the silence confirm what Clarice had already worked out. Or Lillian? Clarice's voice had changed again. There was something in it now that might almost have been warning, or might almost have been something stranger, something that in another relationship might have been concerning. Whatever you are imagining, whatever you think this is, you should be careful. Men like Calverton do not single out women like you. Not for the reasons you are hoping for. The words landed the way Clarice's words always landed, and precisely and with full knowledge of where they would hurt most. Lillian felt the impact of them move through her chest, but she also felt, for the first time in recent memory, something that did not collapse under that impact. Something that held. Thank you for the advice, she said. Her voice was quiet and steady. I will think about it carefully. She turned and walked back toward the house, and this time she did not stop. That evening she sat at her writing desk and took out the letter again and read it one more time. She read the line that said he found it agreeable that she should come. She read the line that said he asked nothing further. She read the final line, the signature, the title, the weight of a name that the world had arranged itself around for 30 years. Then she folded it, placed it carefully in the small lacquered box where she kept the only things that belonged entirely to her, but unclosed the lid. On the morning of the ball, she rose before the house was awake. She washed and dressed in her ordinary clothes first, then sat in the chair by the window with her tea and watched the sky change from black to grey to the pale, tentative colour of a morning that has not yet decided what it intends to be. She was afraid. She let herself feel that clearly, and without dressing it in anything more dignified. She was afraid of the ball, and the people in it, and the distance between what the letter had seemed to promise and what the evening might actually deliver. She was afraid of hoping, and having hope turned into another thing that Clarice could point to and laugh about, another evidence of the gap between what Lillian imagined for herself and what the world considered appropriate for someone like her. But she was also something else. She was tired of her own smallness. She was tired of the cold floor and the dying fire, and the silk cap worn for the comfort of people who had never thought to make her comfortable in return. She was tired of taking up as little space as possible and being grateful for whatever was left over and calling that a life. She rose and went to the wardrobe and took down the wine gown and laid it on the bed and looked at it in the early morning quiet. Mrs. Fallow had done something extraordinary with very simple materials. The silk caught the light in a way that shifted as it moved, warm at one angle and luminous at another. The waist was fitted precisely, the skirt full enough to move with her, the neckline clean and uncluttered. There were no adornments at the shoulder, no fussy details at the sleeve. It was a gown that understood what it was doing and did it without apology. Lillian picked it up and held it against herself, and looked in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman who looked back at her was bare-skulled and clear-eyed, and wearing something the color of the light just before dawn, and she looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone worth looking at. She got dressed. Her father appeared at her door just before the carriage was to be brought round. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, taking in the gown, the bare head above it, the particular stillness she had assembled around herself for the evening. His eyes moved over her face with the careful attention of a father who knows he has missed a great deal and is trying, too late and too slowly, to catch up. "You look," he began, and then stopped. "Thank you, Father," Lillian said, before he could find or fail to find the rest of the sentence. He nodded once. "The carriage is ready." She picked up her wrap, the pale gold one that Mrs. Fallow had included without charging for it, to pressing it into Lillian's hands at the second fitting with a quiet and matter-of-fact generosity that had made Lillian want to cry in the middle of the shop. She crossed the room, passed her father in the doorway, and walked down the hall toward the stairs. Behind her she heard Clarice's door open. She did not turn around. She descended the stairs with her back straight and her bare head level and the wine silk whispering against the steps, for when she walked out of Ashmore Park into the sharp cold of the evening air where the carriage was waiting, and she climbed in, and the door was closed behind her, and the horses began to move. The Greyfield Assembly Ball was 11 miles away. She watched the dark countryside pass beyond the window, and she breathed steadily, and she held, very carefully, the small flame of hope that had been burning in her chest since the night the letter arrived, was sheltering it from the wind of her own fear, the way one cups a candle against the dark, knowing that the light is fragile, knowing it anyway, carrying it forward regardless. The Greyfield Assembly Hall was the grandest building in the county that was not attached to a titled estate, and on ball nights it became something close to a living thing, breathing light and music out through its tall windows into the cold, dark air beyond. Lillian could see the glow of it from half a mile away as the carriage moved along the tree-lined road, a warm and golden spill against the black sky that looked, from a distance, like something out of a story she might have read in the library at Ashmore Park on a quiet afternoon. She had never attended an event like this. She had attended small dinners and occasional afternoon gatherings, And once, years ago, a modest village assembly that bore no resemblance to what awaited her now. She had not had a season. She had not been trained in the particular social choreography of a proper ball, the way of entering a room and reading it, or the way of moving through a crowd without appearing to navigate it, the careful art of being seen on one's own terms, rather than on the terms of whoever happened to be looking. These were skills that Clarice had been given, along with her gowns and her dancing lessons and her 2 full seasons in London. Lillian had read about them in novels. She pressed her hands flat against her lap and breathed. The carriage slowed as they joined the line of other carriages depositing their occupants at the broad front steps of the hall. Through the window she could see people arriving, women in silk and velvet and fine wool, men in dark coats and white cravats, everyone moving with the easy confidence of people who belonged to this world and had never had reason to question that belonging. The light from the hall doors fell across them all in a warm and indiscriminate gold. Her father was beside her in the carriage. He had insisted on accompanying her, another small act of paternal will that she had accepted without comment, knowing it cost him something in the domestic economy of Ashmore Park, and choosing to receive it simply as what it was. Lady Ashmore had not come. She had cited a headache with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has decided something and selected the most convenient explanation available. While Clarice had announced at dinner that she too would be attending the Greyfield ball, which had produced a silence at the table that everyone present had understood differently. Clarice was in the carriage behind them. Lillian had not looked back when they left. She had simply climbed into the first carriage with her father and kept her eyes forward and her breathing even, and allowed the distance between herself and Ashmore Park to grow with each turn of the wheels. "Are you ready?" her father asked, as their carriage reached the front of the line. "No," Lillian said honestly, "but I am going in regardless." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that was trying to make up for years of its own absence. He offered her his arm as the footman opened the door, and she took it, and they descended together into the cold and the light and the sound of music, drifting out from somewhere deep inside the hall. The entry was crowded with arrivals, a press of warmth and perfume and conversation that hit her immediately after the cold outside air. She felt the first looks land on her before she had fully crossed the threshold, the quick glances that moved from her face upward to her bare head, and then moved away again with varying degrees of smoothness. She was accustomed to this. She had been accustomed to it for 14 years. Now she kept her chin level and her pace steady, and moved through the entry hall beside her father as though she belonged there. Because tonight, she had decided, she did. The ballroom itself was extraordinary. It was a long room with a ceiling high enough to make the chandeliers look like suspended constellations, each one blazing with dozens of candles that threw a warm and shifting light across the assembled company below. The musicians were arranged at the far end on a low platform, yet playing something bright and intricate that threaded through all the conversation and laughter and movement of the crowd without competing with it. The floor was polished to a shine that reflected the light upward, so that the dancers seemed to move in a room that had no clear boundary between above and below. Lillian stood at the edge of it and felt something move through her that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but contained elements of both. She was aware of people noticing her, but not in the way she was usually noticed, which was the brief, uncomfortable noticing of something out of place, quickly looked away from. this was different. The gown was doing what Mrs. Fallow had promised it would do. It caught the light of the chandeliers and held it, and the effect was that Lillian seemed, when she stood still, to be very slightly luminous, as though the light in the room had a small preference for her. She saw two women near the refreshment table look at her, and then lean together in conversation. She saw a man across the room glance at her, and then glance again. She didn't see the Duke. She moved with her father toward the edge of the room, accepting a glass of lemonade from a passing tray and positioning herself where she could see most of the ballroom without being in the direct center of it. This was instinct, old habit, the familiar preference for the margin over the middle. Now she noted it in herself and did not entirely fight it. The margin tonight was a conscious choice rather than a retreat, she told herself, and tried to believe it. Clarice arrived 20 minutes after them. Lillian knew the moment it happened because she heard the shift in the room's attention, the subtle reorientation of faces toward the entrance that always accompanied Clarice's arrivals. She was wearing a gown of deep gold silk that made her hair look even more extraordinary than usual. And she moved through the entry and into the ballroom with the practiced ease of a woman who has done this many times and expects to be watched and is never disappointed. Her eyes found Lillian within moments of entering, a quick and precise location, and then she smiled and looked away and began her progress through the room. Lord Ashmore excused himself to speak with an old acquaintance, while Lillian stood alone at the edge of the ballroom with her lemonade and her wine silk, and the particular quality of aloneness that is different from loneliness. That is simply the state of being oneself without company, and she watched the room and breathed and waited for something she could not name to either happen or fail to happen. It was 9:30 when she felt it. Not a sound or a movement she could point to. A change in the quality of the room's attention, or a collective and involuntary adjustment, the way a field of grass all moves in the same direction when the wind shifts. She turned her head toward the main entrance of the ballroom, and she saw him. The Duke of Calverton was not what she had constructed from the sum of his reputation. She had imagined someone cold in the way that powerful men are sometimes cold, with a face like a closed door and eyes that assessed everything in terms of its usefulness. What she saw instead was a man of perhaps 30, tall enough to be visible across the room without effort, with dark hair and a face that was not handsome in the easy, uncomplicated way that Thomas Grayton was handsome, but was instead the kind of face that held attention once it had it and didn't easily release it. He was dressed simply for a man of his position, a dark coat and white cravat, nothing showy, nothing that competed with itself. He moved into the room with the particular stillness of a person who has so much authority that they have no need to perform it. He was accompanied by another man, shorter and broader and more immediately sociable, who was already nodding and smiling at acquaintances as they entered. The Duke was not smiling. He was scanning the room with an unhurried attention that was not coldness, she thought, but rather the look of a person searching for something specific among things that are merely present. His eyes moved across the room. They found her. She felt it as a physical thing the moment his gaze landed on her face. Not an uncomfortable thing, not the familiar prickling of being stared at for the wrong reasons. Something else. Something that held. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the ordinary social glance. long enough to be deliberate, and then he turned to say something to his companion, and the moment was released. Lillian realized she had forgotten to breathe. She breathed. Around her the room continued its bright and busy life, the music and the conversation, and the movement of couples onto the floor for the next set. She stood in her gown with her bare head and her heart beating with more force than was strictly comfortable, and she tried to think clearly about what had just happened, and found that she could not think about it clearly at all. He had seen her. He had looked at her the way the letter had felt, with intention, with something particular in it that she could not name, but could not dismiss either. She became aware, a few moments later, that Clarice was beside her. She did not know how long Clarice had been there. Long enough, from the expression on her face, to have seen the exchange of glances across the ballroom. Clarice was looking toward where the Duke stood, now engaged in conversation with several people who had converged on him with the speed and determination of people who understand the value of proximity to power. Her expression was bright and hungry and calculating all at once. "He is exactly as described," Clarice said, or in the tone she used when she was talking to herself as much as to anyone else. Lillian said nothing. "I had not imagined he would be quite so." Clarice paused, selecting her word. "Present. He fills a room differently from other men." She turned her head and looked at Lillian with the bright, assessing gaze that meant she had noticed something and was deciding what to do with it. "Did he look at you?" "People look at me," Lillian said carefully, "but I am somewhat distinctive." Clarice's eyes moved over Lillian's face and then upward to her bare head in the way they had done 10,000 times before, a gesture so habitual it probably no longer required conscious thought. But something in it tonight was different. There was something underneath the usual smooth dismissal, something that shifted when Clarice looked across the room again at the Duke and then back at Lillian, and did the small, private calculation that her face almost never showed. "Stay close to Father this evening," Clarice said then, in a tone that was almost gentle and was therefore more alarming than her usual sharpness. "This is not the kind of room where you want to be without someone to anchor you." "I appreciate the thought," Lillian said. "Enjoy the evening, Clarice." She moved away before Clarice could respond, stepping into the slow movement of people along the edge of the ballroom, or not toward the Duke and not away from him, simply forward, into the room, taking up space in it, the way she had decided she was allowed to do. The next hour passed in a series of small moments that she would later remember as a sequence of photographs rather than a continuous experience. A woman she did not know complimented her gown. An older gentleman bowed to her in passing with old-fashioned courtesy. She was asked to dance once by a young man she did not recognize, and she accepted and danced badly and was grateful for it, because dancing badly in public was a thing she had never had occasion to do before, and the doing of it made her feel, unexpectedly, more present in her own body. She did not speak to the Duke. She was aware of him the way one is aware of weather, as a constant condition of the environment, rather than a specific event. She knew roughly where in the room he was at any given moment without looking directly at him. She felt, twice more during the evening, the sensation of his gaze finding her across the space between them and resting there for a moment before moving on. It was during the interval, when the music paused and the room rearranged itself around the business of refreshment and conversation, that Clarice found her again. This time they were in the smaller anteroom off the main ballroom, where a fire burned in a wide grate, and the noise from the dancing was reduced to a pleasant hum. Lillian had come in for a moment of quiet, standing near the fire with a fresh glass of lemonade, to letting the warmth of the room settle into her after the cold draughts that moved through the ballroom near the windows. Clarice came in alone. She closed the door behind her, which was the first indication that what was coming was not going to be the usual performance. The usual performance required an audience. What Clarice was about to do, she intended to do in private. When she crossed the room and stood before Lillian and looked at her, with eyes that had dropped all of their social covering and were simply what they were underneath, sharp and afraid and furious in equal measure. "He has been looking at you all evening," Clarice said. Lillian held her glass and said nothing. "I have watched him. I have watched the way he moves through this room and who he attends to and who he does not. And he does not look at anyone the way he has been looking at you. And I want to know why." Her voice was low and tight, stripped of its usual music. "I want to know what you have done." "I have done nothing," Lillian said. "I arrived. I danced once. I have stood near walls and drunk lemonade. That is the full account of my evening. Do not be clever with me." Clarice's jaw was set. "He wrote to father. You went to father. That conversation in the study, the carriage trips you thought no one noticed. What the gown?" Her eyes moved over the silk with something that looked, shockingly, like genuine pain. "You have arranged something. You have found some way to attach yourself to this. And I need you to understand something very clearly before you go any further with it." "Clarice," Lillian said quietly. "No." The word came out hard. "No, you listen to me. This is not your world. This ballroom, this kind of man, this kind of evening. And you do not belong here, and everyone in that room knows it the moment they look at you. You are bald and worthless, Lillian. That is not cruelty. That is simply what you are and what you have always been. And no silk gown and no mysterious letter is going to change what a man like Calverton sees when he looks properly at you. He will look and then he will look away, just like everyone always does. Oh, and you will have made a fool of yourself in front of the entire county, and there will be nothing I can do to help you." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. Lillian stood inside them. She felt them move through her, each one landing in a place that had been struck before, had been struck so many times that the bruising there was old and deep, and had become in some ways simply part of the landscape of herself. She felt the familiar impulse to shrink, to agree, to fold the small flame of hope back into the dark place inside her chest, where it could do no more damage. She did not. She looked at her stepsister, this golden, frightened, furious woman who had been sharpening herself against Lillian for 2 decades, and who was standing here now in a private room because she was afraid, genuinely and visibly afraid, for what felt like the first time. "You are scared," Lillian said. Her voice was very quiet and very steady. "That is the only reason you would say those words to my face instead of across a dinner table." Clarice's expression flickered. "I am going back into the ballroom," Lillian said. "I am going to stand in it and breathe the air of it and exist in it for the rest of this evening, and whatever happens or does not happen, I will still be here. In this gown, with this face and this head and this life that you have spent years telling me is not worth anything." She set her glass down on the mantelpiece with a small, clean sound. "Thank you for being afraid of me, Clarice. It is the kindest thing you have ever done." She walked past her stepsister to the door. She opened it. The warmth and the music and the light of the ballroom came through it like a wave, and she stepped into it. And she did not look back. She had taken perhaps 20 steps back into the ballroom when she became aware that something in the room had shifted. It was the same quality of shift she had felt when the Duke first entered, that collective and involuntary reorientation of attention. But this time, it was more concentrated, more directional, and it was moving toward her. She slowed her pace instinctively, scanning the room, trying to understand what had changed in the few minutes she had spent in the anteroom. Then she understood. The Duke of Calverton was walking toward her, not in the indirect, socially plausible way of a man who happens to be moving in a particular direction and will stop and speak to someone if the opportunity presents itself naturally. Directly. With the unhurried and absolute certainty of a person who has made a decision and is carrying it out, or through the crowd that parted for him, not because anyone asked it to, but because that is what crowds do for certain people without being told. The room noticed. She saw faces turn. She saw fans pause mid-movement and conversations stall mid-sentence. She saw Clarice, who had followed her out of the anteroom and was standing near the doorway behind her, go very still in the way that Clarice only went still when something was happening that she had not arranged and could not immediately calculate. Lillian stood where she was. She did not retreat, and she did not advance. She simply stood in her gown in the middle of the Greyfield Assembly ballroom, with her bare head and her hammering heart. And she waited while the most powerful, unmarried man in England walked across the polished floor toward her, with the whole room watching, and did not stop until he was close enough that she could see his eyes clearly for the first time. They were grey. Not the cold grey of winter sky, but the grey of deep water, the kind that has depth and movement and is not the same colour twice. He looked at her for a moment in silence. She looked back. "Miss Ashmore," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "I am glad you came." "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "I said I would." Something moved in his face at that, something small and not immediately legible but present. "You did," he said, "and you did not ask for explanations first, which most people would have done." "I considered it," she said. "I decided that explanations could wait, and that an evening like this one could not." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the room had achieved a kind of suspended quality, the music continuing and the people continuing, but everything slightly slower, slightly more attentive, like a collective breath held very carefully. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. "Along the edge of the room. I find that conversations of any substance are better conducted in motion." "Yes," she said, because she was done with the word no and the smallness that went with it. He offered his arm. She took it. The sensation of it was strange and grounding all at once, the solidity of him beside her, the warmth of his arm beneath her hand. They began to move along the perimeter of the ballroom together, and the effect on the room was immediate and complete. The suspended quality broke. Sound and movement returned, but the watching did not stop. She could feel it on her skin, all those eyes following the two of them as they walked, trying to understand what they were seeing. She understood the impulse. She was also trying to understand what she was seeing. "You are wondering why I wrote," he said, when they had put some small distance between themselves and the densest part of the crowd. "God, I have been wondering since the evening the letter arrived," she said. "I have not arrived at a satisfying conclusion." "Your father wrote to me," he said. "In his letter he described you in a way that was honest to the point of pain. He said you were remarkable, and that he had failed to protect you, and that if there was any man of character in England who might look at you properly, he hoped that man would have the courage to do so." He paused. It was not a subtle letter. It was not a socially sophisticated letter. It was the letter of a man who loves his daughter and is ashamed of himself. Lillian said nothing for a moment. She kept walking, kept her hand on his arm, kept her face as composed as she could manage, given that the back of her eyes had gone hot and bright. "That must have been a peculiar letter to receive," she said finally. "It was unlike anything I have received before," he said. "Which is partly why I answered it." He glanced at her sideways, and she felt the look the way she had felt his gaze across the ballroom earlier, with a specificity that had nothing vague about it. "I should tell you something. I had heard your name before his letter arrived." She looked at him. "How?" "Mrs. Fallow," he said. "In Harwick. She made a gown for my sister 2 years ago. She speaks of the women she dresses with the authority of someone who has made a serious study of character, and she spoke of you. Not of your appearance, though she mentioned that also. She spoke of the way you sat in her shop and looked at fabric and made decisions with a kind of quiet certainty that she found, her word, rare." Lillian stared at him. "Mrs. Fallow spoke to you about me." "My sister mentioned her. I was in Harwick on business. I stopped in on a whim." He paused. "I do not generally act on whims, but that one I am glad of." She was quiet, processing this chain of small coincidences and deliberate choices that had assembled themselves, without her knowledge or participation, into the circumstances of this evening. "You built a picture of me from other people's accounts," she said. "I built an interest," he said. "The picture I am building myself. Tonight." Another sideways look. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone more guarded," he said. "Given what your father described of your circumstances, I expected someone who had learned to protect herself by showing very little. You show a great deal, Miss Ashmore, not carelessly, but clearly." She considered this. "I have spent a long time showing very little," she said. "I find I am tired of it." "Good," he said simply. They walked in silence for a moment, a comfortable silence that surprised her with its comfort. And then he said, "Tell me something true." "What kind of something?" "Any kind, or something you would not ordinarily say in a ballroom." She thought about it honestly. "I danced earlier with a young man whose name I did not catch, and I danced badly, and it was the most enjoyment I have had in public in years," she said. "Not the dancing. Being bad at something in front of people and surviving it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he laughed. It was not the polished social laugh of a man performing amusement. It was a real laugh, short and low, the kind that escapes before it can be managed, and the sound of it did something extraordinary to his face, loosened something in it that she suspected was not often loosened, and made him look, for just that moment, entirely and unexpectedly human. "That is a true thing," he said. "Thank you for it." "Your turn," she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might decline. Then he said, "I find these evenings genuinely difficult. Not socially, but I can manage the social mechanics of any room. I find them difficult because everyone in them wants something from me, and every conversation is therefore a kind of negotiation, and I am tired of negotiating. I came tonight because your father's letter reminded me that somewhere outside the negotiation there are still people who simply are what they are." She looked at him. "And am I what you expected? From that description?" "You are considerably more," he said. And he said it in the tone of a statement of fact rather than a compliment, which made it land differently than a compliment would have, more solidly, with more weight behind it. They had made a full circuit of the room's edge. Ahead of them, the crowd was thicker again, and she could see Clarice standing with a group near the refreshment table, watching them with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and was not entirely succeeding. Out beside her was Lady Grayton, and her son Thomas, who was also watching, with the expression of a man who is recalculating something he thought he had already calculated correctly. She also saw her father. He was standing near one of the tall windows, slightly apart from the company around him, and he was watching his eldest daughter walk through the ballroom on the arm of the Duke of Calverton, with an expression that she thought, from this distance, it might have been the closest thing to joy she had seen on his face in a very long time. "My stepsister," Lillian said quietly as they walked, "said something to me this evening, in the anteroom. She said I am bald and worthless, and that a man like you would look at me properly and then look away. She said it without drama, without the tremor in the voice that the memory of the words still wanted to produce. Or she said it because she had decided that the only way through the weight of those words was to say them out loud to someone who would hear them clearly." The Duke's arm shifted slightly beneath her hand, not pulling away, a subtle settling, as though he had adjusted his position to make the contact more deliberate. "She said that to you tonight," he said. Not a question. His voice had not changed in temperature, but there was something different in it. Something careful and controlled. "Yes. Then she watched me walk across this room toward you," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, for the second time that evening, and again the word was simple and complete and contained more inside it than its single syllable suggested. They slowed to a stop near the center of the room, where the space was widest and the light from the chandeliers fell most directly. It was, she realized, the most visible point in the entire ballroom. Not the edge, not the margin, but the center. He turned to face her. The room was watching. She could feel it with a completeness that she had never felt before in any room, because what they were watching was not her strangeness or her bare head or the discomfort that her presence sometimes produced in people who didn't know where to look. They were watching her because the Duke of Calverton was looking at her in the center of the Greyfield Assembly ballroom, as though she were the only point of orientation in the room, was as though everything else in it, the music and the candles and the silk and the accumulated social weight of everyone present, was simply the background against which she existed. "Miss Ashmore," he said, in a voice that was quiet, but carried in the particular way that quiet voices carry, in rooms that have gone very still. "Would you do me the honor of the next dance?" The next dance. In the social language of this world, the one she had read about in novels and been excluded from in life, but the next dance from a man of his position was not a casual request. It was a declaration made in public, in front of witnesses, in front of everyone who would carry the news of it home tonight and repeat it tomorrow and the day after, until it had reached every drawing room in the county. It was the kind of declaration that could not be undone. She thought of the cold floor of her bedroom, as she thought of the dying fire and the silk cap and the 14 years of pressing her palm against the smooth top of her head in the dark. She thought of Clarice's voice in the anteroom, delivering the verdict that had been the verdict of this house and this world for as long as she could remember. Bald and worthless. She lifted her eyes to the Duke of Calverton's grey ones, and she felt, with a clarity she had not known she was capable of, that she was standing at the precise boundary between the life she had been living and something else entirely, and that the step across it was hers to take. "Yes," she said. "It would be my honor." He offered his hand. She took it, and the room, which had been holding its breath, breathed. The dance was a waltz. She had not known it would be a waltz when she accepted, had not thought to consider what kind of dance it would be, had been too occupied with the enormity of saying yes to think about what yes would require her body to actually do. When the opening notes came, and he turned to face her, and placed one hand at her waist and took her other hand in his, she understood that she was about to waltz, in public, in the center of the Greyfield Assembly Ballroom, yet with a man she had met 20 minutes ago, and already felt she had known for considerably longer. She told him the truth immediately. "I am not a confident dancer." "I know," he said. "I watched you earlier." She looked at him. "And you still asked?" "Because of how you looked afterward," he said, not embarrassed, alive. She had no answer for that. So she let him lead, and she followed. And what happened was not elegant, but it was real. Two people moving through a room full of watching eyes with more honesty than grace, and finding that honesty, in this particular moment, was the better of the two. She was aware of the watching the whole time. She was aware of Clarice at the edge of the room, standing very still in her gold gown, with her beautiful hair and her careful face, and the particular stillness of someone watching the world rearrange itself around a person they had always considered beneath rearrangement. She was aware of her father near the window, no longer pretending to look elsewhere. She was aware of the whispers moving through the room like wind through grass, quiet and continuous, and full of the specific energy of people witnessing something they will be talking about for months. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the Duke, who was looking at her, and she let the room do what it needed to do around them while they remained, for the length of the waltz, or entirely inside their own small world of music and movement, and something neither of them had named yet, but that was present between them as clearly as the music itself. When the dance ended, he did not immediately release her hand. He held it for a moment longer than was strictly required, long enough for everyone watching to see, long enough for the gesture to register as deliberate. Then he brought it to his lips and pressed a brief and formal kiss to her gloved fingers, and the room produced a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite silence, but was exactly the sound of collective understanding arriving all at once. "Walk with me," he said quietly. "There is something I wish to ask you, and I would rather ask it somewhere less theatrical." She almost laughed. "You just waltzed with me in the center of that room in front of the entire county." "Yes," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "I have no objection to theatre when the occasion calls for it. What I am about to say calls for something quieter." They slipped through a side door that opened onto a long corridor lined with tall windows, dark beyond the glass. The sound of the ballroom reduced behind them to a muffled warmth. Candles burned in wall sconces at intervals, casting a soft and private light. The corridor was empty. Their footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. He stopped near the second window. She stopped beside him and waited, or because something in his manner told her this was a moment that needed to be given room. "I am going to say something that will sound either very certain or very sudden," he said. "I suspect it is both, and I ask you to hear it as something I have considered and mean, rather than something the evening has produced in me carelessly." "I am listening," she said. He looked at her with those grey eyes that she was already, she realized, going to miss if she never saw them again. "I want to court you properly, with your father's permission and your own, which matters more. I want to visit Ashmore Park, and I want to write to you, and I want to sit across from you at a table and have conversations that are not constrained by the length of a dance or the watching of a room." He paused. "And I want to do it with the intention of asking you, eventually, a question that I will not ask tonight, because tonight is too new, and you deserve to be courted before you are asked anything that is permanent." The corridor was very quiet. Lillian stood in it and breathed and felt the words settle around her like something warm and solid, the kind of warmth that doesn't ask anything of you but simply exists and lets you exist inside it. "You are very direct," she said. "I have found that indirection costs more than it saves," he said. "In most things." She thought of her own letter to him. "I will not pretend otherwise. I have learned that honesty costs less in the long run than performance." She almost smiled. "We may have that in common," she said. "I think we have more than that in common," he said quietly. "Though I intend to spend a considerable amount of time finding out exactly how much." She looked at him for a long moment. This man walked across a room full of witnesses toward her, without hesitation, who had laughed a real laugh at something she said, who had listened when she told him what Clarice had said in the anteroom, and had responded not with outrage or reassurance, but with a single quiet word that contained both. "Yes," she said, "you may court me." Something in his face shifted, and what was underneath it was not relief exactly, but was close to it, close enough to tell her that beneath the certainty he had presented to her, he had not been entirely certain. What, and the knowledge of that made him more real to her than anything else that had happened this evening. "Thank you," he said simply. They stood for a moment longer in the quiet corridor, with the candle light and the distant music, and then they walked back into the ballroom together, and the evening continued, and nothing was the same as it had been before. The courtship lasted 4 months. He came to Ashmore Park 3 times, for arriving each time in a carriage that the whole village noticed, and that Lady Ashmore received with a brittle graciousness that cost her visibly. He sat in the small drawing-room that had always been Lillian's least favourite room in the house, and somehow made it feel different simply by being present in it. He brought books twice, not gifts chosen to impress, but books he had actually read and thought she might find interesting, what with small notes tucked inside marking passages he wanted to discuss. He was right about the passages every time. He wrote to her between visits. Long letters, not the brief and careful kind of letter a man writes when he is managing an impression, but real letters. The kind that wandered and considered and sometimes arrived at a conclusion the writer had not anticipated at the start. She wrote back in kind, and found that the person she was on paper was the person she had always been in the library and the garden and the cold quiet of her own room, the person who had simply never been given the space to exist in company before. Clarice left Ashmore Park 6 weeks into the courtship. She went to stay with a cousin in Bath, announced with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has decided to remove herself from a situation that is no longer developing in her favour. Or she said goodbye to Lillian in the hallway, with a composed face and eyes that said something her voice didn't, or something that was complicated and unresolved, and possibly in some form she would never directly acknowledge, a kind of apology. Lillian said goodbye to her without cruelty, and without warmth, and with the particular piece of a person who has put something down that they have been carrying for too long. Lady Ashmore remained. She was quieter now, recalibrated by the new mathematics of the household, which had shifted irrevocably the night of the Greyfield ball. She did not become kind, but she became careful, which was in some ways more useful than kindness, and the small daily erosions that had been the texture of Lillian's life at Ashmore Park slowed and then largely stopped, like a clock that had been wound down. Lord Ashmore changed most visibly of all. He began appearing at breakfast before anyone else. He began asking Lillian questions at dinner, and listening to the answers with the attention of a man who has remembered something important and is determined not to forget it again. One afternoon in December, he came to find her in the library and sat in the chair across from hers and said, without preamble, that he was sorry, and he said it in the direct and unadorned way of a man who has decided that elaborate expression is less honest than simple statement. And she believed him, and she told him so, and they sat together in the library for the rest of the afternoon, reading their separate books in the particular companionship of two people who have found their way back to each other through territory that cost them both something real. The Duke asked his question on a Tuesday morning in February. He had written to say he would come, and she had known from the letter that it was coming, not because he said so directly, but because of the quality of the letter, or the care in it, the way it moved toward something without quite arriving. She wore a deep cream dress and her bare head, and she sat in the drawing-room and waited, and when he came in and sat across from her and looked at her with those grey eyes that she now knew as well as her own face in the mirror, she waited for him to speak first. He did not make a speech about it. He said simply, "Lillian, will you marry me?" She loved him for the simplicity of it, for the lack of flourish, the absence of performance, the plain and earnest directness of a man asking a real question and genuinely waiting for the answer. "Yes," she said, I will marry you." He reached across and took her hand and held it, and the fire in the drawing-room burned warmly, and outside the February sky was pale and clear, and the house was quiet around them, in the good way that houses are quiet when something right has happened inside them. They were married in April, for the church was in the village nearest to Calverton Hall, a small and ancient building with stone walls that had held centuries of weddings and knew how to hold one more. It was not a large wedding. The Duke had expressed no interest in spectacle, and Lillian had expressed even less, and what they had assembled instead was something better than spectacle. A small gathering of people who were genuinely glad, which is rarer and more valuable than a large gathering of people who are merely present. Her father walked her down the aisle. He cried before they reached the front, quietly and without apparent embarrassment, and she pressed his arm with her hand as they walked, and he pressed back, and no words were needed for what passed between them in that moment. She wore ivory silk, not the wine of the Greyfield ball, something simpler and softer, with long sleeves and a clean neckline, and nothing at the shoulder to compete with the clean line of her bare head above it. Mrs. and Fallow had made it, of course, and had delivered it to Calverton Hall 2 days before the wedding, with the expression of a woman who has done her finest work and knows it, and requires no one to tell her so. The Duke turned when she reached the front of the church. He looked at her the way he had looked at her, across the Greyfield ballroom, with that particular quality of attention that made her feel, every time, as though she were the only fixed point in whatever room they happened to share. But there was something more in it today. Something that had not been in the ballroom because it had not yet had time to grow. It was the look of a person who has spent 4 months learning someone and has found, at the end of those 4 months, that what they learned exceeds what they hoped. She took her place beside him. Oh, the ceremony was simple, and the words were old, and the light came through the high, narrow windows of the ancient church and fell across them both in a way that she would remember for the rest of her life, gold and quiet and completely, entirely real. When it was done, he took her hand again, the same hand he had taken in the drawing-room in February, the same hand she had placed on his arm in the Greyfield ballroom, and they walked back down the aisle together, through the small and genuinely glad gathering of people who loved them, and out through the church doors into the April morning. The air was warm. The trees along the churchyard path were in a new leaf, that particular green that only exists for a few weeks in spring before it deepens into something more ordinary. Somewhere nearby, a bird was singing with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a creature that has no awareness of being observed and is simply, entirely itself. She stood in the churchyard with her husband's hand in hers and her bare head in the April sun, and she felt, moving through her from somewhere deep and long neglected, a feeling so large and so clean that she had no single word for it. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She squeezed her husband's hand. He squeezed back. Above them, the April sky was the color of something that has no name, but that everyone recognizes. That pale and perfect blue of a day that knows it is beautiful and does not need to announce it. And the bird kept singing, and the new leaves moved in a light wind, and the Duchess of Calverton stood in the morning sun and let herself be, completely and without apology, exactly who she was.